Good morning, eighth grade. I'm going to finish reading chapter 10 of our George Müller book for you this morning. By lunchtime, George had rearranged the forms 5 or 6 times as he waited for a knock at the door. The attic walls needed to be painted, but he hated to go upstairs and get up to his elbows in paint because the girls would be arriving at the door at any moment, or so he told himself. But the girls did not arrive. By 5 o'clock that night, not a single orphan had arrived at the fully equipped orphan house. The new house parents had been by several times to see whether anyone had shown up, and since no one had, they left for the day. The beds that George had expected little girls would be climbing into sat untouched, their bedspreads unruffled. George was not humming when he walked home that evening. In his mind, he reviewed the past 7 weeks. What had gone wrong? Had he become too proud of what he was doing? Was that why God did not entrust a single child to him? Hadn't he prayed hard enough? Was the whole idea of a free orphanage for needy children just too far-fetched? Were the naysayers right after all? George did not know the answers, and by the time he swung open the door to his own house, his heart was heavy. Mary rushed to meet him, with Lydia not far behind. "Tell me all about it," she said, her face beaming with an expectant smile. "What are their names? How many are there? How old are they?" George shook his head as he took off his coat and scarf. He sat down heavily in a chair. "There aren't any," he said with a sigh. Mary frowned. "What do you mean, George? There aren't any what?" "Any orphans," he replied flatly. The smile evaporated from Mary's face and was replaced by a horrified look. "You mean not a single girl came?" she questioned. George nodded. "Not a single one," he answered. And then he added, "Maybe this was all a mistake after all." Mary walked over to her husband and put her hands on her hips in a determined stance. "How can you say that, George Müller? Look at all the prayers God has answered for us. Isn't the house an answer to prayer? Look how much money has been provided. Isn't that an answer to prayer too? And the calico, the dishes, the furniture, everything in that house is an answer to prayer, and we both know it." George lifted his head and looked at her for the first time since entering the house. "I know," he shrugged, "but there aren't any orphans. And that's not an answer to prayer, is it, Mary?" With that, Mary clapped her hands together and laughed out loud. Startled, George stared up at her. This was no time to be making fun. Couldn't she see that? "But George," she said, her shining eyes wrapped up in a broad smile, "that's the whole point. We never did pray for children. Don't you see? We prayed for coal and food and paint and workers, but we never thought to pray for children." George was laughing now. "Mary, you are quite right. I didn't think we needed to because there are so many orphans on the street, and I was sure we'd have applications for more people than we could house." He caught his wife by the waist and swung her around. "Let's go and pray, Mrs. Müller," he said. For the second morning in a row, George hummed as he walked to Wilson Street. This time he felt sure the orphan girls would come. After all, he had asked God to send them, and send them he did. The first children applied that day. By the end of the month, the orphanage housed 26 girls, and 42 more were on the waiting list. It was April 2nd before George found the time to organize an official opening ceremony. Hundreds of people came to see the orphanage and to listen to Henry Craik preach at the official opening. George thanked the many hundreds of people who had helped make the orphanage a reality. Some, he pointed out, had helped in large ways, such as with the ton of coal that had been delivered to the house one day, and the anonymous gift of 100 pounds that had arrived the next day. But many of the gifts had been small, yet they meant just as much both to the person who had given them and to George, who told how a small boy who looked like he could have been an orphan himself knocked boldly on his door the day before, a shilling held tightly in his hand. "This is for your girls," the boy said when George opened the door. "I found a ring, and when I returned it to the owner, she gave me a shilling for being so honest. Here it is." A woman in Bristol sent George 5 shillings with a note saying she had gone to buy a new dress and deliberately chose the plainest one she could find, rather than the more elaborate and expensive kind she normally purchased. The 5 shillings represented the money she had saved by purchasing the less expensive dress, and she wanted the orphanage to have it. The year rushed by at a hectic pace. Besides having 30 girls to care for, George was still pastor of Gideon Chapel, which was growing rapidly, and he had not eased off in his efforts with the scriptural knowledge institution for home and abroad. 350 boys and girls were now in school, and the teachers' salaries, rents for the classrooms, and books were all provided by the institution. It seemed that the more responsibilities George took on, the more he was able to carry. Although George never asked for help with the orphan girls, offers poured in. A local doctor offered to treat the girls for free, and George's old church at Teignmouth sent supplies and money to help. Housekeepers, laundry maids, and matrons either volunteered their services or agreed to work for lower wages than they could earn elsewhere. Most people would have thought the hardest thing about starting an orphanage was raising the money, but for George Müller, the hardest thing was turning away needy children. The orphanage was not set up for boys or girls under 7 years of age. It upset George greatly to have to tell a child or the child's temporary guardian that he was unable to help. So even though he told no one, from the day of the official opening of the orphanage at number 6 Wilson Street, a plan had been taking shape in George's mind. According to his plan, there would be a second orphanage and a third, until every orphan in Bristol was being taken care of, taught to read, and told about God. In October, George felt it was time to start putting his plan into action. He rented a second house located at number 1 Wilson Street. The house was ideal in many ways. While it was an exact replica of the number 6 house and all the other houses in the long row that ran along Wilson Street, number 1 was at the beginning of the row and had an empty corner lot beside it. George managed to rent both the house and the adjoining lot. By the end of November, the house had been outfitted with cribs and rocking horses, and the lot had been turned into a playground for both orphanages. On November 28, 1836, the orphanage at number 1 Wilson Street was opened for business. Some of the older girls from the other orphanage helped with the babies and toddlers at the new one. Many of the girls would be going into domestic service as nannies, and the younger children gave them someone to practice their skills on, though a matron was always watching to make sure the babies were bathed and played with properly. The week leading up to Christmas was a happy one for the Müller family, and especially happy for the children in the orphanages. The children's eyes shone with delight as they asked George how many more days there were to go and what they would be having for Christmas dinner. George loved to tease them and tell them he had forgotten all about Christmas. Of course he hadn't. He knew it would be the first real Christmas for many of the children, and he prayed that God would make it memorable for them. Christmas was memorable. All sorts of wonderful and delicious things were brought to the orphanage by the people of Bristol. Turkeys and ducks hung in the laundry room ready to be cooked. An enormous drum containing 100 pounds of treacle, that's syrup, sat in the corner of the kitchen, its top slightly askew where some of the children had already tasted its thick, sweet contents. Oranges and bananas from a shipment that arrived in port from the West Indies were sent to the orphanage, and many churchwomen made new Sunday clothes for the girls. As George gathered his family, 60 orphan children, the orphanage staff, and Henry Craik for Christmas dinner, he could not help but smile with pure joy. He wondered what the policeman in Wolfenbüttel would think of him now. It had been 15 Christmases ago that he'd sat in a cold, bare prison cell there after being captured, trying to leave town without paying the innkeeper for his room. If George could have seen then what he was to become, he would never have believed it. God had taken George Müller, the boy who cared for no one but himself, and turned him into a man now responsible for the lives of dozens of orphan children. What a journey it had been, and George could not help but wonder where he would be and what he would be doing at Christmases to come. To be followed by Chapter 11, Food for the Children.